Here's a number that should stop everyone cold right now. 32 billion. That is what Canada's dairy production quota system is worth today. Not the milk, not the farms, not the cows, just the licenses, the legal right to produce milk inside Canada. Across the country, 9,700 farms hold pieces of this quota, with the majority concentrated in Quebec and Ontario, two provinces that carry massive political weight in Ottawa. And in June 2026, this $32 billion system became the absolute center of North American trade friction. If you're new here, hit subscribe and join Money Signals. This channel covers the stories that actually move money and power, and this one moves both in ways most people haven't fully understood. To see why this is the flashpoint of 26, we have to look back at why this system exists. Canada began building its supply management structure in the 1960s, not as an ideological project, but as a survival mechanism. By the early 60s, a University of Waterloo historian documented that the federal government was burning through $50 to $55 million annually in unsustainable subsidies to keep farmers from going under as milk prices crashed. Ottawa pivoted to a structural solution, eventually formalizing it through the 1972 Farm Products Agencies Act. The system was built on three pillars that had to function in tandem: production discipline, cost of production pricing, and import controls. That third pillar, import controls, is exactly what enrages Washington today. Canada limits foreign dairy access via a tariff rate quota, TRQ. Under CUSMA, the U.S. gets tariff-free access to only 3.5% of Canada's domestic demand. If a single kilogram of American milk exceeds that, the tariff doesn't just nudge up, it explodes. We are talking 241% on fluid milk and 270% on blended dairy powder. Donald Trump has been vocal about that 270% figure since the 2018 G7 summit, and as we move through 2026, his trade representative, Jamieson Greer, has doubled down, telling Congress that the CUSMA reviewed depends entirely on resolving this dairy access. Washington has stopped treating this as a minor irritant. They have framed it as a structural condition for the entire trade relationship. The impasse over Canada's dairy quota is not an accident. It is the culmination of a deliberate cross-party legislative strategy designed to preemptively dismantle American leverage. Following the volatile start to 2025, which saw the U.S. implement 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum and threaten broader sectoral sanctions, Ottawa's response was not to retreat, but to formalize a no-negotiation zone. By June 2025, the Canadian Parliament had passed Bill C-202 with unanimous support, an act that legally bars any Canadian trade minister from increasing tariff rate quotas or reducing over-quota tariffs on dairy, eggs, and poultry. That detail tells you everything about the shift in Ottawa's psychological and strategic posture. They moved the defense of their domestic agricultural asset from the flexible, vulnerable realm trade diplomacy into the rigid, binding realm of statutory law. DairyReporter.com is show 1. This legislative wall is the defining feature of the 2026 CUSMA review. When Washington's trade representative, Jamieson Greer, frames dairy access as a structural shortcoming, he is looking at a ledger where the math no longer balances. The U.S. strategy throughout 2025 relied on the assumption that Canada would eventually reach for a familiar compromise, offering minor dairy concessions in exchange for relief on industrial tariffs. However, Bill C-202 stripped that mechanism of its utility. A minister can no longer offer a win to the Americans on dairy, even if they wanted to, because any concession would be an illegal act under the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act. This forced Washington to reconsider its entire playbook. They are no longer negotiating with an administration, but against a fixed, unanimous parliamentary consensus. Denton's The Economic Reality underpinning this standoff is stark. Canada's trade relationship with the United States accounts for roughly $900 billion in annual activity, a figure that dwarfs any other bilateral partnership on the planet. Yet, the friction persists in the shadow of this massive total. Consider the steel and aluminum sector. As of mid-2026, despite various remissions, the 25% tariff on U.S. origin materials remains a potent bargaining tool that Ottawa uses as a mirror. When Canada retaliated in 2025, It did so with surgical precision, targeting agricultural and manufactured goods in states like Iowa and Ohio, the exact political heartlands of key Senate committees. This is trade war as political surgery. Each retaliatory move is designed to force American producers to lobby their own government to drop the broader tariff regime. Cushman and Wakefield yet, Washington remains divided. Internal documents and statements from the Pentagon suggest a growing tension between trade hawks and defense planners who recognize that tariffs on Canadian steel are, in effect, a tax on American defense readiness. As the Aerospace Industries Association noted in a formal brief, U.S. supply chains, including the F-35 program, really on Canadian alloys. This creates a strategic vulnerability for the U.S. administration. Every tariff they apply to punish Canada creates a direct inflationary and logistical cost for their own defense manufacturing base. That internal conflict is precisely what Ottawa's negotiators are now exploiting. They don't need to defeat the U.S. in a total trade war. They simply need to hold the line until the cost of the trade war becomes domestically untenable for the White House. The Digital Services Tax, DST, represents the only genuine zone of fluid movement left on the board. Unlike the dairy sector, which is now shackled by the unanimity of Bill C-202, the DST remains a regulatory lever that the Carney government can adjust. With $2.1 billion in annual revenue at stake, Ottawa faces a genuine fiscal squeeze, but they also have the political space to modify the tax's scope or threshold to satisfy Washington's demands. This is where the real horse trading is happening behind closed doors. Canada is essentially signaling that it will trade its digital taxation sovereignty to keep its dairy sovereignty intact. It is a strategic sacrifice of a secondary front to preserve the integrity of the primary agricultural defense wall. As the July 2026 Free Trade Commission review session approaches, the strategic picture is clear. The dairy impasse is no longer a topic for negotiation. It is a static condition of the relationship. Both sides will likely declare progress on steel quotas and digital tax adjustments, while the dairy file is simply logged as an unresolved grievance. But beneath the surface, the core question remains. Will Washington accept this new reality of a protected Canadian economy, or will the persistent pressure from the American dairy lobby eventually force the U.S. to challenge Canada's supply management system through the formal CUSMA dispute settlement mechanism? That legal battle would take years to resolve and would risk the stability of the entire $900 billion bilateral trade frame. As we head toward the autumn sessions, the question is not whether the dairy system survives. It is whether the broader North American trade framework can withstand the strain of two nations committed to fundamentally different definitions of fair market access. The impasse over Canada's dairy quota, formalized by the legislative rigidity of Bill C-202, represents a decisive pivot in North American trade strategy. As we have observed, Canada has effectively locked the door on a specific sector, choosing to sacrifice negotiating flexibility to secure the political survival of a $32 billion asset class. This is not merely a bureaucratic stall. It is a calculated structural defense that shifts the burden of proof back to Washington. For the U.S. administration, the options are no longer about winning a concession at the table, but about deciding whether to escalate a multi-front trade war that risks destabilizing a $900 billion bilateral relationship. Syngenta Canada, the strategic shift here is profound. By legislating their own constraints, Canadian negotiators have signaled to every mid-sized economy that the old model of give-and-take trade diplomacy is being replaced by a model of commitment strategy, where you make your own flexibility structurally impossible to force your larger partners into a new set of calculations. For the United States, this means the dairy lobby's demand for market access now clashes directly with the Pentagon's and the automotive industry's need for continental integration. The U.S. is forced to choose push for dairy access and risk the total cohesion of the CUSMA framework, or treat dairy as a permanent, non-negotiable grievance and focus their leverage elsewhere for other international players. From the European Union to India, the lesson is starkly clear. Domestic political coalitions are increasingly overriding international trade commitments. The era of the unfettered negotiator is fading. Governments are now using parliamentary unanimity as a shield against the asymmetric pressure of larger global powers. As we approach the autumn 2026 sessions, the likely outcome is not a resolution of the dairy issue, but a managed impasse. Washington will pivot to sectors where movement remains legally and politically possible: steel quotas, digital services tax adjustments, and procurement frameworks, while dairy remains a silent, static, and untouchable monument to the power of domestic political persistence. The core insight of this entire story is that in the modern global economy, trade power is no longer just about the size of your market or the weight of your tariffs. It is about the durability of your domestic institutional walls. Canada has successfully traded the illusion of negotiating flexibility for the reality of structural immunity, forcing the U.S. to operate within a set of constraints that were not just agreed upon, but explicitly legislated into existence. In the high-stakes game of North American trade, the most powerful move wasn't a counter-tariff or a threat. It was a unanimous vote in a quiet room that changed the math for everyone involved. The wall is built, the debate is over, and the new reality of trade is here to stay.